Good afternoon, my name's Bruce Pattinson and I'm bringing this lecture to you from the Total Education Centre. Today's lecture we're talking about the writing task and a little bit of creative writing and how to manipulate your writing to suit a creative writing piece that's going to be marked and examined. So we're going to have a look very specifically at how to do that and what features that you need to include to make sure that works. For more assistance in this matter, you can always visit totaleducationcentre.com.au and get some resources from there. Feel free to do that anytime. Don't forget, if you like this lecture, give us a like down below, for the button down below, and you can leave a comment or ask a question at any time. We certainly hope these lectures help you, and we look forward to doing them, and we certainly look forward to getting your comments and ideas. So let's talk about a creative writing task now. A creative writing piece would normally have a beginning, a middle and a conclusion. And these in English terms are often called the orientation, the complication and the resolution. So what do we have to do in our orientation? Our orientation is our introduction to the reader. It's what catches them or engages them in the story. So there we're going to give the reader the who, the what, the why and the where. And that orientates them into the story. And I'll say that again, it's the who, what, why and where. And that's your orientation. You might include all those things immediately, but you have to give the reader some sort of orientation to make sure they know where they're going, what's happening, and just let them get into the story as such. If you don't do that correctly, they won't read on and you're going to struggle to engage the reader, and that will lessen your marks, or they'll just stop reading altogether if you're not writing for that purpose. So what happens in that middle? In the middle you need to build and create yourself what we call the complication, and that is something goes wrong or there's some form of conflict. If you don't have a form of conflict in your story, and it doesn't have to be a major conflict, it can be not like a war, it can be psychological conflict, it can be internal conflict, small external conflicts, anything that makes the story interesting for the reader. And that's probably through that conflict is where your themes and ideas and purpose come through. So that's very important. You need to develop and build on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The final thing, that element of probably, I suppose, a short story or a very brief creative piece, is the resolution. And this is the ending, and you need to round out your story for the reader and not necessarily leave it hanging in the air. You need to give them some form of resolution, even if you're leaving space for an extended piece for your story. They need to feel that they've achieved something and gone somewhere with the story. And always remember that it doesn't necessarily have to be happy. You can certainly have a sad ending to your story. And you look at that sort of thing and you see some of the great pieces of literature have had not unhappy endings, but very bleak and dismal feel to them, and that comes back to tone. So where do we go from there? If you've done that, the most important thing that you need to think of next is, how do I grab my audience? How do I get the reader's attention? And that's probably going to be focused more on your introduction than anywhere else. You need to engage them the whole way through the story, of course, but in your introduction you need to really look for a hook or something to catch their attention and grab them and make sure that they want to read on. And you can do that in many ways. It can be a character focus, a setting focus. You can introduce your mystery or the unknown very early in it. You can introduce your conflict there, right there and then. Or you can use different styles of writing, like a short sentence, a very long sentence, something that meanders and engages us. But it's got to engage in some way. And remember, if you're doing in New South Wales and you're looking at the HSC, we're doing the discovery topic for your short creative piece in your HSC, so you need to introduce what element of discovery you're talking about there and then. You also need to think very carefully about your form and how you're going to structure it. I talked in the lecture on essay writing about paragraphing, and that's going to be pretty much the same for the narrative. So if you haven't seen that, go back, have a look at that, look at the paragraph structure I gave in the essay lecture, and use that to bind your story together and make it around. It's got to flow. Think about all the things from the stories that you've read that make them interesting. You're going to use now some techniques of your own. You're not going to be just talking about other people's techniques, but you're going to be using techniques of your own. So when you build a story and build an idea, you can develop those techniques, and you should be writing lots to practice those, and you'll be using things like similes, imagery, and all those sorts of technical terms, onomatopoeia and all those sorts of things to engage and make sure your story. You also remember when you write your creative piece, you need to think about what audience you're aiming for. So, the language needs to be appropriate for that audience, the terminologies need to be appropriate for that audience, and you need to think about that very carefully. Now, what sort of topics should you be writing about? Well, if you're doing discovery, obviously you'd be talking about some form of discovery, but within that there are lots of different things to talk about. And you need to choose a topic or a style that you can feel comfortable with, and a story that suits you. You'll be often given stimulus material that tells you what to write about, but you can have a general idea of the things that interest you. For example, there's no use writing a forensic medical story if you don't know anything about it. You can't pretend that you're something you're not. You need to focus very clearly on what you should be doing. There are lots of ideas that I can give you here, and I'll put some ideas at the end, and there's some websites you can go to for ideas if you're really struggling. But really, we're talking about feelings and experiences. You can talk about textual issues, media issues, things that you've gotten out of your text. In this case, of course, it'll be discovery. You can talk about real life situations and changing the names and places, social issues and problems, historical issues, reminiscences, family life, leisure, recreation, sports, personal problems, positive events, and characters from the past and the present. You can integrate those. There are lots and lots of things, and they're just a small sample of those things that you can work in and write your story about. So you need to be thinking very carefully about that and sort of plan ahead. And I've talked about planning very carefully previously in the essay lecture. So you need to be very careful and plan as well your creative writing. And I know that sounds silly because it's supposed to be creative, but you need to really work out where your story's going. And I think you should think about, those three areas and make sure you have. There's no point writing your story and then coming to the end of it and not having a conclusion, or not being able to end it clearly and thoroughly. So, plan, and plan. Again, I'll say that. I know I said it in the essay lecture, but you just can't dive in and just write whatever you feel like, really. You need to think about where it's going, what your purpose is going to be, what your idea is going to be, how you're going to bind them together. It's got to go somewhere. It's got to have a purpose before you begin. Your first idea is not always your best idea. You might get a piece of inspiration, start writing, and then, I've seen this many times, the first two paragraphs are crossed out because they ran out of ideas. Think about an idea and try and develop an idea that you can actually sustain all the way through. And that's so important. It's got to have all those elements that engage the reader each time. Write, and write some more. Don't waste time. Just keep writing. If you want to be a good creative writer, you have to write. At the end of this, go out, sit down, write for 10 minutes. Think of a story, think of something that happened today, make it witty, make it entertaining, make it interesting. Start there. Just keep writing. I think you need to try and rewrite a few introductory paragraphs. If you get a story you're very happy with, work on a few different introductory paragraphs, go back and rewrite those. Find the one that's most engaging and find the one that works best on readers. Give it to people to read and say which one you like best. Work through that one, and then you'll just get a feel for the techniques that suit you and how you're going to work those things. You've got to hook them in an introductory paragraph, as I said. If you don't get them in the introductory paragraph, your story could be lost. It's very important, and a reader likes to have some sort of purpose to the piece. It's not just you're writing a story that's going nowhere and doesn't mean anything to them. They want to have some substance behind it. So think about the idea, the purpose of it, what's it's going somewhere. Your actions need to have consequences. Every action related to a story should be necessary to it. Don't just try and fill it up with fluff. If you need to, use great, and you should use great detail in your descriptions. You don't have to avoid the boring and mundane details, I should say. So for example, in the old days, when you were little, you wrote a story, and then I woke up, and then I had breakfast. It was 7 o'clock. Mum cleaned up my plate. I moved out. those sort of things. We don't need those sort of details. What you're looking for is detail relevant to the story, and you need to make sure that the descriptions that you write are very interesting and you're engaged in that story. Use direct speech by all means, but avoid the tedium of he said, she said, and be very careful with your punctuation. And I'd like to talk about writing dialogue effectively just for 1 minute because it's so important and people get that so badly wrong. What is said is placed in quotation marks, okay? Only what is being said. Who said what is noted, so you need to have someone speaking, unless you're a very, very good writer. If the same two people talk for an extended period, it is not necessary to indicate who says what, as it becomes obvious. Each new speaker begins a new line. The first line of dialogue is very important and is indicated. Narration doesn't need a new line, so you can continue that on. Before you close the quotation marks, you must finish what has been said with a piece of punctuation. So it's going to be a full stop, a comma, a question mark, an exclamation mark, or some ellipses. I'll put all those rules at the back on a sheet on one of the slides for you, so you've got all those. I like people who use dialogue, but you've got to be very careful when you use it and follow those rules. Short sentences are also generally better than those that ramble, and don't try and compact a novel into a short piece. You're writing a little piece of creative writing, make sure you're doing the appropriate form. There's no point in trying to make it go too long or too far. You've only got a certain amount of time. Make sure you use that clearly. So, what about some final writing tips? They're the basic ones that you should use. Keep looking for ideas, keep reading widely, share your writing with people. Just make sure that you've got everything really well honed. Follow those ideas I've given you and make sure that you've got just a really nice couple of pieces of writing you can use in various ways, especially for those students in New South Wales who are doing the discovery topic. Make sure that everything relates back to that, okay? My name's Bruce Pattinson. I'll bring you this lecture from the Total Education Centre. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed this lecture, give us a little like down below. Don't forget, any comments are fully appreciated. Let me know. Thank you and goodbye.